You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Live from WCAT St. Louis, you're listening to Humble Faith with your host, Sean Kelley.
As you know, this is Humble Faith, a place where normal people can express their fears, doubts, concerns, and questions about faith. I'm Sean Kelley, your host, and I'm really excited to introduce you to our amazing guest this evening. His name is Jim Agresti. Jim Agresti has a really unique approach to faith in that, he has a logical, fact-based approach to faith and life in general. In fact, Jim is actually the founder of a website which I really love. I've actually become quite addicted to reading, called justfacts.org. And Jim also is the author of a book called The Rational Conclusions, which I have not read yet, but I'm really excited for Jim to kind of hit me with some of those approaches tonight to challenge my faith-based logic or my mindset about faith. So, Jim, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining our show tonight, Humble Faith. We're grateful for you. And second off, I'd love to hear where did your website, justfacts.org, what inspired you to build that website? And then how does rationality and facts just come into your approach to life and faith? Where does all that come from?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. So actually, the origin of Just Facts is somebody my brother Tom, who one day showed up at my house with a computer. I didn't even have one. It was in the mid-1990s, and said, "Hey, we have a website." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He goes, every time I talk politics with people, they give me their opinions. You're the one guy who gives me facts. So I purchased a domain name, justfacts.com. You're going to give me facts, and I'm going to publish them on the website. And quite frankly, the website was incredibly antiquated, even for its time. And I'm an engineer by training, and I have a degree in mechanical engineering. And I wrote like an engineer. It was not the most fluent English, but it was factual. And we developed the following over time. Now, backing into the whole thing of rational conclusions, shortly after getting this started, I started writing a book based upon my walk as a Christian, because I was an atheist until about the age of 25. And a pastor at a church where we were attending asked me to prepare a series of messages for high school kids who were struggling with their faith, and say, explain to them why you are a Christian. And I did that over the course of several weeks. The kids really enjoyed it. And I said, I have a book here. And I thought to myself, part-time, about a year, I'll be able to write this book and publish it. Sean, it took 10 years and 14,000 hours on top of a full-time job, on top of being a dad, on top of, life in general. It was an enormous undertaking, because what I wanted to do is produce something that was documented to the hilt with credible primary sources, so that it would appeal to someone in my mindset, an engineer, skeptical, atheistic, scientific-minded, and really, if they were honestly looking, provide the answers and the documentation to prove that what the book said was true. Now let's bring that around to Just Facts. After this book was about finished, I noticed one day we got a link from the government of Taiwan in New York City. And I went over there. I'm like, why are they linking to Just Facts? Because we had some facts on China and Taiwan, and they had a page of U.S.-based think tanks. And amidst the big dogs in the field, I'm talking like the Heritage Foundation and the Hoover Institution and large organizations that had Just Facts listed. So that thought occurred to me, wow, what if I were to start a think tank or a public policy research institute? Long story short, here we are many years later. We got the thing started. It was rough going. It still kind of is, quite frankly, from a financial perspective. But we have had an enormous amount of opportunity to reach people, because major media outlets, influential people, famous people have cited, quoted, commended our work. So that's kind of like the story of my post-engineering career in a nutshell.
Well, it was pretty cool, because shortly after I had met you for the first time on a phone call from an intro from your awesome brother, Tom, I was actually just perusing Twitter, and I bumped into, Elon Musk had, I think, tweeted or posted, whatever they do on Twitter nowadays, and he had posted some, cited justfacts.org, and I was like, hey, I know the guy that founded that site, so it was pretty cool. So I've seen that, and congrats on all your success with that. And I'm going to send many prayers your way that Just Facts continues to reach many public eyes. So and that you're able to grow the finances of that company. So and Jim's whole approach to this fact-based approach really intrigues me, and this is the reason I'm so excited to interview him on tonight's show, is because, well, as you all know, some of you may know if you're an avid listener of Humble Faith, that I grew up in this atheistic household. My father was a scientist; he was an astronomy professor, and he always explained to me how the universe is a certain way, and this is science, and the Bible doesn't have science in it. And Jim is a contrarian to that belief, and so I'm really excited to explore the topic. And it's funny because when I reached out to Jim and I was like, well, what faith-based topic would you be most comfortable discussing? And he gave me this list, and the list was it was like 10 bullets long or so, and every single item on the list, I was like, man, I would love to talk about all those. And he's like, well, that would probably be like 10 hours of conversation. I'm like, okay, well, our show's an hour, so I had to pick one. So I appreciate you providing such a great list to discuss. So I went through the list, and the one I landed on was amazing facts that modern science has discovered that were written in the Bible thousands of years ago. So I'm really excited, and I know my father. I believe my father is hearing me from beyond. He's left us here on earth, but I want him to listen to the show. that's my goal here. Is I'm gonna pray my father hears us, and that maybe it changes his mind wherever he's at. So all that being said, Jim, let's start off with a question on this. What are some of the most, I guess, clear scientific truths that were described in the Bible long before they were discovered by modern science? Could you share some of those key discoveries with us?
Sure. But I'd like to do it in a way that kind of puts you on the spot, if that's okay. What I'd like to do is give you a science test and see how you fare compared to the Bible. Because I'm a guy that was raised in the world of science, educated in that world. Like I said, I was a mechanical engineer. I attended Brown University. I was a devout atheist. I shouldn't say a devout atheist. I was a firm atheist. And so I always thought, before I read the Bible, that the book was just loaded with all this nonsense that was unscientific. And what I learned by really studying it is that it's uncannily consistent with science in some really unintuitive ways that you just would say to yourself, wow, that must be divinely inspired, because how would anyone know that thousands and thousands of years ago when we we just learned it very recently. In fact, many people today still don't understand these concepts, but they're amazing innovations of modern science. So here's the question for you. Does time have a beginning?
Does time have a beginning? I guess so. This is a total guess. So for the record, you listeners all know this is live, inauthentic discussion. None of this is rehearsed. I had no clue what he was going to ask me, nor did I study for this test. So, with all that being said, I would say no. I don't think time could have a beginning.
Yeah, that would be a very intuitive thing, because it's something that just seems to be all-encompassing. It must have always been there. It'll always be there. But this is what Einstein's theory of general relativity has proven, that time itself had a beginning. This isn't coming from, it says it in the Bible, twice in the Bible, it talks about before the beginning of time, which seems absurd on its face. It's in there twice. So here's one of the implications of Einstein's theory of general relativity, is that time itself must have had a beginning. And what I show in Rational Conclusions, by the way, you can check out the website at rationalconclusions.com, and the book's available on Amazon.
I can't wait to read it, Jim. Seriously, I'm picking up a copy after our interview tonight.
Okay. So, but all the footnotes are there. So if you look in the footnotes for chapter 6, you'll probably find it in there, although my memory might be off. It might be chapter 10. But everything I backed up with like secular sources for the most part. So I'm pulling this stuff from scientific textbooks, a college astronomy textbook, like your dad, things of that nature. Another piece of evidence that shows that time has a beginning is the second law of thermodynamics, which shows that over time, the disorder of a closed system will increase. The universe, by definition, is a closed system. So if time extended into the infinite past, we would now have what's called an infinite amount of entropy in our universe. It's called something that scientists call a heat death. Basically, the most disorganized form of mass and energy is heat. And when it's spread out uniformly, there's nothing that can happen. The universe is dead. So if the time didn't have a set existence at a certain period, that's where we'd be at right now.
Wow. Wow. That makes perfect sense. So you're saying that if time did go on forever and ever, there was no start to it, and it just did go on infinitely, then we would be at the point where the universe would have decayed, burned out, whatever, because of the law of thermodynamics. So basically, something started the clock, or someone, in the case of God.
It's so funny you use that phrase, Sean.
For you listeners on the radio, this is my head exploding. Okay. I knew this was going to be great. I got goosebumps, Jim. Sorry, keep going, man.
That's okay. So there's a PBS Nova series, and I'm trying to remember the physicist's first name, but his last name is Green. And he talks about this principle. And it's a completely secular, atheistic view of things. But this is what he boils down to it when he starts looking at all this. He goes, what wound the clock? What got this whole thing started? And he realized something must have started at a certain juncture in time. He doesn't even address the issue of God, but it's like screaming, yeah, God wound the clock. Because, well, let's get a little wonky here, okay? So I'm pulling this from a college textbook called Foundations of Modern Cosmology. It was published by Oxford University Press. And what it explains is this. Given the universe is constantly winding down, becoming more disorderly, having more entropy, it must have started in a state of very low entropy, meaning high organization. And the way the textbook says it like this, again, this is just screaming God. This implies a specialness of initial conditions to an almost incomprehensible degree. And they put numbers to it. I'm not going to delve into that, but the numbers are far beyond what is considered random chance. You know, when you get to a certain exponent, I've seen different figures from 20 to 50. The odds of something happening are essentially zero. In this case, they use the number 10 to the 123rd power to say how unlikely this is. And one of the biggest reasons that people who have science mindsets are skeptical of the Bible are the miracles in it. They say, hey, I'm a person of science. I don't believe in miracles because miracles are by definition a breach in the laws of science, right? But here's what they're missing. The initial conditions of the universe are so special and so unique that the greatest atheistic minds who have ever lived, I'm talking about people like Stephen Hawking, try to explain our universe, the incredible amount of order it has in it, and the special conditions that are necessary for life and everything we see around us by saying, well, the universe, like the book says, was born in a state of special initial conditions, the universe, but this doesn't require a miracle. And I'll tell you why. I'm paraphrasing Hawkins here, right? The reason is that there are an infinite number of universes. And we just happen to be the one that was born in the special initial condition that allows for life. And he even said this. He goes, there are actually universes out there where the moon could be made of Roquefort cheese. And he goes, I'm not talking science fiction. Now, I want you to step back on this. First of all, a criteria of science for something to be scientific, it has to be falsifiable. The existence of alternate universes we cannot even access, cannot be falsified. Ergo, it's not even a scientific theory. But this is how desperate an atheist has to get, who's really intelligent and understands these things to justify what they see around us. They have to go to these extremes. So the question isn't, what do you believe in miracles? It's what miracles do you believe in? Do you believe there's an omniscient, all-powerful God who created our universe? Or there are an infinite number of universes out there, one in which the moon could be made of cheese? It's not, and do you believe in miracles? Everyone does to some degree, whether they realize it or not.
Wow, that's so powerful. And it reminds me of something. My wife and I went and saw Jordan Peterson speak. He came to St. Louis, and he was talking about how we as human beings, if you try to take God out of our belief system, something will always fill that void. Something else, like you have, basically, we as humans have to have a belief system, whether that's belief in the moon of cheese or belief in God. We will believe in something, and something will fill the God void, and nothing else that fills that void makes us whole people who are, truly, I guess, satisfied, happy, I guess, satiated from within, right? So that's such a great way to look at it. It's like, if your belief system is, so if you don't believe in God, then you have to ask, what do you believe in? And if it ends up being a moon with cheese, a moon, a universe where there's infinite universes where the moon can be made with cheese. And also, I mean, you got to really question that. Like, well, what if that belief's wrong? What have you got to lose? You know, the exponential probability that everything that really hit home with me too, because just from a mathematical standpoint, like when you look at a DNA molecule and to say that happened on accident, I mean, it's really wild. I was listening to, and I can't remember there's an astrophysicist who's also a believer. I was listening to him on YouTube. Something you just said reminded me. He probably read your book, but he said that God made the entire. This is what he said, and I was like, wow. And I'm wondering if you have any recollection of where this ties in the Bible, because I sure don't. But he said that God made the entire universe just so we could exist in it. So like the whole universe that God created is all for us. And he talks about how like we're in a specific place in the Milky Way where if we were, you know, at a different area, we wouldn't be able to see the universe, but we can really see most of the creation of God and how the whole universe, every planet, every moon, every speck of ice dust in space exists so that we could be here. And then also he talks about how we get to be alive during a very finite amount of time. And, you know, in the Bible, it's, you know, he went on to talk about how the new world, once, you know, Revelation's over, once the world as we know it is done, and then there's this a new world where believers will be with God. What's your take on that from a scientific standpoint?
Well,
on some of the things I just said.
That gets to the question of the afterlife. And you would think that, hey, it's an afterlife, it's inaccessible by science. However, we have a recorded phenomenon among many people who have died and then been brought back to life. They were legally dead, brainwaves, heart, however it's measured, for an extended period of time. And they come back and they reveal things and say, I saw this person and this person and this person, and their name was this, this, and this. And they say, who are those people? And they go, well, that's your grandmother. You didn't know her. Or there have been instances, actually there's one recorded in a medical journal where a person was legally dead and saw one of the nurses take his glasses and put them on a cart under something in a thing, dead as a doorknob, right? And the person gets back to life and says, where'd you put my glasses? And they said, why are you asking me? He says, I saw you put them in a cabinet. And the guy's like, how could that be? You were dead. So this is not just urban lore. These are things that are well documented in numerous cases that, hey, something does happen here in these outside of these four dimensions in which we live. And by the way, I wouldn't call that ironclad evidence. I just call it telling evidence, something to say, hey, there may be something else out there based on this evidence. But I think when you take all of the evidence in the Bible and compare it to what we can know about the facts of history, archaeology, and many different sciences, and you told it all together, it is overwhelming. People say, well, what's the strongest evidence for the accuracy of the Bible? I'd say all of it. The strength is not in any one piece. It's in the totality of it, which was enough to convince an atheist like me that God is real and the Bible is truthful.
That's really powerful stuff. And I don't think you and I have not spoken before about faith and where my belief comes from, but you know, I got to experience that side of it firsthand, truly, when I was in the hospital and I'd almost died of COVID, and I was out. I mean, I was truly, you know, I think I was out for about 48 hours in a medically induced coma sort of situation, and I remember looking down at my body in the hospital room, and it was not the same room that I'd come into the hospital on. And then before I was whisked away into space, I got to see, I just remember looking down at my room and thinking, where am I? This isn't the same room I was in. And I remember seeing this big metal box in the window thinking, like, what's that thing? And then when I woke up and I opened my eyes, it was there. And but I'd been out for 2 days. And thankfully I didn't have to flatline to experience that, because I know so many people do, but I definitely got to experience that side of things. So I'm one of those people where when you start talking about that, I'm like, yeah, that's real. The glass was in the cabinet. I could totally relate to that, just firsthand experience.
That's remarkable. I had no idea you went through that.
Yes. In 2021, I almost died of COVID, and then literally it was, Jim, every night I would wake up about 4 a.m. and it was like, and my wife said when I got out of the hospital, I was in for almost close to 2 weeks, and when I got out of the hospital, I was just reciting scripture in my sleep, and I'd wake up at 4 a.m. and I had to write. Anyway, that's where the book The Visitor came from, because it was about my near-death COVID experience. And yeah, it was powerful stuff, man. So that's one of the reasons why this show exists, actually. That's why God put us together here tonight, my friend. So
That's powerful.
so
It's really powerful.
very, very, yeah, and that's why I'm so excited to read your book, because mine was written just based off sheer, like the Holy Spirit was like, put this in paper and get it published. And whereas yours, you put so much thought and deliberation into making sure that people that read it can arrive at rational conclusions. And I'm so excited to experience that side of faith, because and it's like, if I had that before, maybe I wouldn't have had to have my near-death experience and my close call with divorce with my life to become a full unbeliever. So I really can't wait to read Rational Conclusions. Okay, so segueing in, now I want to talk about, if you have any more scientific, discoveries that tie into the Bible, I'd love to explore that further. But before we do, let me hit you with this question. If we are given proof that God exists, like we take all the data and the facts and we're like, okay, there is proof that God exists, are we eliminating the value in having faith and being a believer?
So I would say this. I veered away from the word proof in my book, and I typically do in my conversations. And I typically use words like evidence and corroborated and supported. And I write this in chapter 10 of Rational Conclusions, that if God were to offer us definitive proof by his presence, by by his power, that we could not deny, I think it would destroy the chance for a meaningful, loving relationship with God. And I'll tell you why. Imagine an all-powerful being that could take from you or give from you whenever he wants. How could that relationship be anything other than one that is based on wanting, exploitation? Like, hey, God, nice God, I love you. Don't kill me. And by the way, give me this car. So I think God deliberately scales back some of his power so that we can have a true love with him, as opposed to one that is just based on forgive the term, but kissing butt. Okay. Yeah. So I think the evidence for God is strong and compelling. I don't think it's enough to convince a closed-minded person. And I think that's good. I think if we're that strong, there would be no chance for a meaningful relationship with God.
It's interesting you mentioned the relationship with God, because that's I've been really thinking about that and reflecting on that lately, because, and I forgot what sent me down this mental path, but I just am trying to figure out, like, why would God make us in the first place? Like, why? And then to me, it's like, well, why do we make a family? Why do we make kids? Because, well, if we're created in God's image, then we want to be around people who love us and that we love them, right? Like, love is, and that is what, if God is love, then that would make sense why we are constantly seeking out love in our lives here on earth. So what if God created us because he wants to be around people? He wants to be around, people that love him and that he loves too. So if that's the case, and then it's funny too, because like, as a business owner, I was talking to one of my employees about this the other day. I'm like, listen, man, if they're getting value out of our services, then they'll want to be with you. And if they don't want to be with you, then it's okay to move on from that relationship. Then so like, why would you want to be around people who don't love you? So God's like, hey, so this is my theory. And by the way, smack me if I'm wrong on this, Jim, please, because I really appreciate and respect your knowledge here. It's like, so God gave us free will, so we could choose to love God and be with God. And then now God can say, cool, you love me, we're going to hang out for an eternity together because we care about each other that much. Or he's like, if you don't love me, no problem. Like, you can walk away from me. And then there's obviously consequences, because, again, you replace God with something. Well, what is that? And so is it possible? How do you feel about I guess the conclusion I'm arriving at, that like God made us because he wants us to have free will so we can choose to be with him, so God gets to be in eternity with other beings that love him. Could it be that simple? What are your thoughts, man?
I think you hit the nail on the head. True love requires choice. If God made us robots, we could never really have true love for him. It's got to be something that's willing. And this gets into a whole doctrine. I can hear Calvinists' head exploding that believe in predestination. I don't want to get too deep into the well here, but I think you are absolutely 100% correct.
Awesome. Well, that makes me so happy, because I was like, man, I'm going to, once I share this publicly with someone like you, they're going to come at me from 12 different reasons of why I'm wrong. So that is actually, that is really rewarding to I guess realize that my rational conclusion ended up in the right spot. Thanks, Jim. So what else do you feel like on the scientific side? What else do you feel like? What other discoveries are tied to the Bible?
All right, you ready for your next test?
Yes, sir. Bring it on, man. Bring it on. I'll just see students. Just remember that.
What causes the waves you see at the beach?
The waves you see at the beach those would be vibrations from the Earth shaking, moving through space, which causes molecules such as oxygen, wind, different molecules of the air to push up against the ocean. And then you've also got the moon that is circling the Earth and pulling gravity, which pulls the water towards it. Which as the moon travels around the Earth, then that pulls the water, which creates waves. And then so I think there's a myriad of things, but layers to that question. But I would say that would be my overarching answer.
Okay, so you got some of it right, and you got some of it wrong. So I once posed this question to 10 friends that have Bachelors of Science degrees, and only one person got the right answer, which is the waves you see at the beach are primarily caused by the wind. And at that statement is actually in the Bible about God using the wind to lift up the waves of the sea. Most people, I think it was 8 of them, said something you said, which is the moon. But the moon causes tides, not waves. So this is another example where the Bible was completely scientifically accurate. Yet in this day and age where we have unprecedented access to information, most people don't get that question right. By the way, I learned the answer to that question in a college course called The Ocean. So when I read it, it jumped right out of me. Hey, I learned that in the ocean. Pretty cool.
That's amazing. And this is a book written, some of it thousands of years ago. And if you think about, they didn't have any way of proving that back then, did they?
No, they didn't. Another example would be the Bible says, and I think it's the book of Job. By the way, that last one was from the book of Psalms. So these are all Old Testament books. They're 2,000 plus years old. Job is considered to be the oldest, or one of the oldest book in the Bible, more than 3,000 years old. And it says that God hangs the earth on nothing. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment, because, we all understand gravity today. But back then, everything had to be held up by something, right? But yet God hangs the earth on nothing. I'll give you another really cool example. So the Bible says that Jesus, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, was anguished and sweat blood. Now, here's a really cool thing. For centuries, people have been reporting, I sweat blood. I was so nervous, I sweat blood. And doctors have been, and family and friends have gone, yeah, just like Jesus. Yeah, I get it. You're a religious crazy who thinks they see things, and you probably had a red sweater on, and rubbed your forehead with the sweat. And what's been documented recently in peer-reviewed journals is that approximately at a rate of about 2 per year, among the billions of people on Earth, about 2 per year actually experience documented sweating of blood. And the phenomenon has been tracked out. What are the odds that the Bible would have that right? Something that is scientifically valid, yet so extremely rare that in a population as enormous as it is today, we only see 2 cases a year.
Wow. Yeah. So there's 7 billion people, and that goes back to those exponential odds you were talking about.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Those are that's pretty crazy, man. I cannot wait to get my hands on Rational Conclusions, Jim. I'm gonna overnight it, and I'll probably have it read by. I'm gonna be texting you all sorts of stuff. You know that. So, all right, I want to segue into how does faith and research, or faith and research, like reason that comes from research, right? How does that coexist in Christianity? My first thought is people that are I need to find evidence and proof of that. Is that almost blasphemous to God? Does God want us questioning him in that way? What are your thoughts on that?
So the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So I think the idea that we have to have a blind faith is not biblical. Yes, there is a place for trusting in God without having physical evidence, as we talked about earlier, but he gives us evidence. Paul talked about, hey, everyone is excused before God, has no excuse before God, because his reality is made real by the evidence of the things he has made. Now let's jump back to Hebrews 11:1, because you may pick up a Bible right now as you're hearing this and go, it doesn't say that in my Bible. There are several different translations of that verse. There's, I don't know, 100 different Bible translations. The translation I'm giving, I forget if it's from King James or NIV, one of those two. But I've researched this back out in the Greek. And that word for evidence is alehos. And when you study its usage in other parts of the Bible, it actually means something by which something is proved. So God doesn't expect us to just blindly believe in him. He's given us evidence all along the way by the beautiful things he has made, by the beautiful things in our lives, by sending Jesus in the flesh so that people could see him, touch him, walk among them, so that Thomas, doubting Thomas, could put his hand in his wound. So God is not averse to giving us evidence. He's not averse to us putting out fleeces. But sometimes we can be too demanding. Hey, God, if you're there, do this. And God is not a gumball machine whereby he gives us whatever we want when we put a quarter in. That's not the nature of God. And that wouldn't be God, the God of the Bible, at least, if he could be manipulated that easily. He's our God. We're not his.
Wow, I see what you're saying. It's crazy. You talked about that. It's like I was doing out of my men's Bible study that I get to go. Every Tuesday I'm in my hometown, and I think it was during I think it was like Mark 14 we were into, or it was one of the chapters in Mark, and it was the point where Jesus gave the Great Commission, where he was basically commanding everyone to go out and create disciples and followers, and he was trying to get everyone to, his apostles to go out and bring people to God. And but in the very beginning, it freaked me out. It was such a nuance. But in this chapter, it was like, Jesus gathered, and this was right after he had just rose from the grave, and he gathered them all around. It said Jesus gathered his disciples around him, and they doubted. They doubted. And I'm like, okay, this freaks me out, because so we read the chapter, then we pray on it, and we just then we talk about what stood out to you. And that stood out to me, because I'm like, if he just rose from the grave, well, how are they doubting him? So like, even if God did come down and said, hey, here I am, I'm here to be your gumball machine, like, would people still doubt? And if so, why? That's a deep question, I know. And it's but why do we still doubt, even when we see the evidence is there? And I've seen the evidence in my life so many times, and still doubt tries to find its way in. Why?
Well, I think it's our very nature. I mean, if you look at the ancient Israelites, it was constant. God would do one thing to deliver them, and 10 years later, they'd be up to no good, just having forget. So I think we have a propensity to forget. But also, we have an innate skepticism. Miracles are not things that happen every day. So, when Jesus rose from the dead, some of his disciples said, it's a ghost. It can't be him. This is impossible. So, yeah, it's just our nature, I think. And I think it's the nature of God to give us some space, to leave some room for belief. Blessed, as he said about Thomas, blessed are those who believe and have not seen me. He didn't castigate Thomas, I don't believe, if I remember correctly. He said, hey, there's room for this, and there's room for this also, for believing without seeing. But along the way, he provides evidence in so many ways of our lives, if we'll just tune into it. One of the greatest scientists of all time, and he's really overlooked, is a fellow by the name of George Washington Carver. He's known for developing many different products for peanuts. He's considered a peanut farmer, but he was extraordinarily brilliant. And he said something along the lines of this. I'm not going to say it as eloquently as him, but he said, I believe that nature is a broadcasting station that God gives to us to tell him, I'm here, if we'll just listen and pay attention. Problem is, we oftentimes don't listen.
It's so true. Like, question for you: Can miracles? I just took a couple notes. I got to circle back on some. Can a miracle be small? Does a miracle have to be this grandiose? Someone rose from the dead. I mean, can a miracle be something small in your opinion? Like, what's your definition of a miracle?
Yeah, well, a miracle by definition is a breach in the laws of science. Which, if there's a God who made everything and made the laws of science, he certainly has the ability to breach them because he controls them. I think there are coincidences. I don't know that I would classify them as miracles, where seemingly God has put circumstances around you that could be interpreted as chance, but very strange. I can think of so many in my life. One is when we were getting Just Facts started. I mean, we were really desperate for cash. We were making nothing. I had very little in the bank. And just simple things like a spice would run out, right? And my wife would go, we're out of cumin or whatever it is, right? And she'd go, it's $4. She goes, I'm not getting it. And then we run out of something else. And then once she went to her sister's house and she goes, I've got these 2 spices left over. I never use them. Do you want them? And they're the exact 2 spices we ran out of and decided not to buy. That's a simple little thing, but situations like that could be multiplied endlessly. I mean, how many times are you in church and you're listening to a message and the pastor says exactly what's on your mind? It's almost like he read your mind and he was talking exactly to you. This verse speaks exactly to the thing you're pondering, questioning, struggling with. That's a coincidence? Is it a miracle? Again, one of them, 2 of them, I'd say probably not. Hundreds of times in my own life, I'd say yes. I think God is working behind the scenes to make these circumstances in my life for my benefit and those of everyone. If we'll listen.
I think that right there is the key. It's like it is the listening to that and paying attention to those things. I couldn't agree more. I want to share one with you that happened just a couple weeks ago with my daughter and I. I've been wanting to have something tangible with me that I can use as my reminder that I can pray. Because the more we all really you can't eliminate bad habits, right? You can only replace them with something else. So I'm like, anytime I'm thinking about sinning or I'm thinking in the wrong direction, I want to have something to lean on. So I'm like, I'm going to get myself a rosary. So I started researching, different types of rosaries, and being a combat veteran and some special ops in the Army, I'm like, one stood out for me. It's called the Combat Rosary. So I started reading up on the Combat Rosary, which was really cool. There's a lot of miracles tied to it, back like from World War II, for instance. There was a monastery in Japan, in Hiroshima. It was either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, I forget which. But there was a monastery priest, and they all had the Combat Rosary, and they were actually praying the Rosary on it when the nuclear bomb went off. And that was the only building that was not destroyed was their church, and every one of them survived that blast. And that's just one of many. There's so many miracles tied to it, some like the war. But so long story short, so I'm on Amazon. I find this, I search it up and I order. I'm like, I can't just order one for me. I got to get one for my 2 daughters, my son, and my wife. So I order, 5 of them. Anyways, so they were scheduled, and I was like, man, I can't wait to get the rosary. I'm going to keep it in my pocket from now on. And it was scheduled to come in Monday. Well, I was flying out Sunday, and I was going to be gone for a week. And of course, I've gone my whole life without carrying a combat rosary, right? But now that I've ordered it, I want it now.
Yeah.
Immediate gratification. You know that. So it stuck out in my mind that I was going to be leaving, and I was bummed out I wasn't going to have it. But whatever, I'll just get it when I get home. Well, it was like Thursday night before that following week when these were supposed to come in the mail. And my daughter, my wife calls me, and she's like, our 8-year-old Emma. So my 8-year-old Emma has this really rare physical condition. It's called Marcus Gunn jaw eye winking syndrome. It's like one in a bajillion people get it, and it's harmless. But basically, when she chews, and she's 8 years old, when she chews, her eye blinks while she's chewing. I think it's adorable. But all that being said, it'll go away as she gets older. Well, so that's a blessing. But for the first time ever, someone made fun of her. So there was a new girl in school, and the new girl literally was having lunch with Emma and all her friends, and she was like, "What's wrong with your eye?" And Emma's like, "Oh, it blinks when I chew." And she's like, "That's gross." And she started making fun of her. My daughter, it like crushed my daughter. And then she went around and was like telling people, like, "Look at her eye," and pointing at her throughout the lunchroom. So of course, my first as a protective father, I'm like, I start to feel a rage, and I'm like, no, I got to coach my daughter through this. I got to, help her get through this. And I'm like, okay, how can I help her get over this and move forward? And then literally, so my wife brings my daughter home, and we're sitting there, and I'm talking to my daughter, and she was really hurt, and I could tell like she was just wounded from this. She's not used to getting made fun of, And then all of a sudden, as I'm talking to her, I'm thinking to myself, okay, how can I help her move past this and forgive this girl? And all of a sudden, the doorbell rings, and I go over to the doorbell, and then a package had been delivered, and it was the box of combat rosary. Now, the interesting thing about the combat rosary is that it has the pardon cross on it. So the pardon cross, it signifies it's when Jesus, was being crucified, and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And that the whole point of the combat rosary having that is the soldiers who have to commit, have to kill, I guess, for their country or for their people, can be forgiven for what they've done. And when that got delivered, right at that moment that I'm having this conversation and trying to figure out in my head how I'm going to help her get through this, to me that was a miracle, as small as it was. And I brought it out, and I didn't even have to tell her. I told Emma, I ordered these, and I said, now I showed her on Amazon. I was like, these were supposed to be delivered Tuesday or whatever day next week. I was like, but they just showed up right now. I was like, now, and I explained to her, I go, this is the pardon cross. Here's what it means. I go, why did God deliver this to you right now? She goes, and she started crying tears of joy. And she immediately was like, because I'm supposed to forgive Agatha. And it was so beautiful. And she forgave her and she goes, thank you, Dad. I love it. And she hugged me. I was like, no, thank you, God, And literally she went to school the next day. She went up to Agatha and said, I forgive you. I'm not mad at you. And I'd appreciate if you don't, talk to me about that, talk like that about me. And they literally are now buddies. And it was so beautiful. So that was just one of those little things that I'm like, does that qualify as a miracle? But whatever it is, it was definitely God, being there for us. Just one of the things because I was listening for it, I feel like.
Sean, that is a truly beautiful story, and trying to maintain my tough guy image by not letting my eyes well up. But that was really amazing.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. I just see I have so many like that. Just because now that I've been, I guess, acute, I started listening. But that's what you said. If you just listen for them, you just look for them, they're there. I think, I wonder how many of those messages from God just go miss because we're just not believing and we're not listening for them. How many people are missing those gifts? And it's so sad when you think about that.
Yeah. And also some of those gifts or coincidences or miracles or whatever we're going to call them are not always pleasant. Sometimes God is trying to teach us something and we can get mad at God or claim, well, if there was a God, this wouldn't have happened to me. When in fact, he might be trying to teach us something very valuable if we'll just listen.
That's why you mentioned the book of Job earlier. And it was interesting in that book how, Job was really questioning God and like, why? And then God answered. And he wasn't really nice about the response, but for God to answer that in and of itself is nice, in my opinion. But he's very candid in that book. What do you mean? So tell us more about that. Like when bad things are happening to us, how is that God doing good in our lives?
Well, sometimes it can be. We're both old enough to have seen things in our life that we thought were bad that turned out to be very good. That wouldn't have happened if these bad things hadn't happened. There's also bad things that happen because we do bad things, because we're sinful. And God gives us moral laws in the Bible, not to prevent us from having fun, but to protect us from being hurt. We've all broken them. We're all sinners, which is why we all need a savior. So a lot of it is just us flouting what God says. And then, of course, there are these, what's called act of God, a hurricane. I think of these poor people in North Carolina. And that's part of the consequences of living in a sinful world. And you say, well, that's not fair. They didn't sin. They're not Adam and Eve. Well, guess what? If I were there in that Garden of Eden, I would have eaten that fruit. And so would have everyone else, because we have all ultimately defied God. So I think a little perspective on all of this is really important. I recently read an essay on emotional sobriety. It was really interesting. And it was talking about, when you're a kid, you don't know how to control your emotions. You have no context. And as we mature and age, we learn that skill. We have a little more wisdom and knowledge. We understand that a lost toy is not the end of the world and we shouldn't cry about it for a week. But some people don't develop that, either due to childhood trauma of some sort. So they go through life trying to medicate or find some sort of addiction to fill that void that they don't have. But then there's a whole nother level of emotional maturity that God has. And that is a wisdom of saying, even though you were washed away in that flood, I'm now welcoming you into a heavenly kingdom where you will have no worries, no fears, no heartache. You will be embraced by perfect love. And it's that infinite perspective that really brings us the true maturity to say, hey, God, I know you've got my back. Even if something looks horrible to me, I know ultimately you'll work it for my good because I love you. I trust you. I've been called according to your purpose. And that's what real faith, the strongest, deepest faith that is all about. I have not been tested in that way, and I hope never to be tested in that way. But the fact of the matter is many people were tested in that way. Going back to the time of Jesus, one of the historians, the ancient historians who wrote about him, was a fellow by the name of Cornelius Tacitus, who was the greatest first century Roman historian. He wrote about Jesus, where he lived, when he lived, that people called him Christ, which is Latin for Messiah, that he was executed, the manner of execution, and the name of the person who carried out that, gave the order to carry it out, Pontius Pilate. But then he wrote this. He wrote during the time of the Emperor Nero, which was within the time of Jesus' lifespan, like his contemporaries were alive. He tortured and put to death people, Christians, for confessing to a most mischievous superstition that Jesus rose from the dead. Now think about this. If you were one of Jesus's contemporaries, would you submit to being brutalized by the most powerful man in the world if you were not certain he had risen from the dead? I wouldn't. I'd go, maybe he didn't. I heard it from my cousin Vinny, and maybe, Vinny gets a lot of things wrong. Sorry, Vince. Right. And so the point being is that these people believed, Jesus's contemporaries believed he rose from the dead, so much so that they were willing to put their lives on the line for it. And not just their lives, but a brutal, painful death.
Yeah, it's that is so powerful, man. And I think, who I feel sorry for is them. And then in the future, when, Revelation comes, the people that are going to have to do that same thing again. And, I pray every day that I'm not put to that test. But I know that I would pass it because I'm a believer and I have no choice. But man, I feel for those people that have been through that in the beginning when Jesus came. And it's interesting you brought that up too after you talk about Adam, because I think in Corinthians, in fact, my one of my faith mentors, Sam Cavett, who I think you may know, he works at the Mercedes-Benz in Music City, right in Nashville. So he was telling me how in Corinthians it talks about how Jesus was the second, or is the second Adam. And then you think about, well, wait a minute, if he's the second Adam, but Adam sinned with Eve, so what does that mean that he's the second Adam? So you kind of made me think of that, because essentially, like, okay, he's our chance at redemption. He's our chance to, kind of restart humanity the way it's supposed to be. So I want to circle back to something you said earlier. You said nature is broadcasts. Nature's broadcasting faith or God all the time to us. What made you say that? What are some of the ways that you see nature broadcasting faith? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Sure. So, chapters 6 to 9 of Rational Conclusions go into this in depth. And what they show is that the incredible complexity of life that we have around us, and everything from the universe to the earth to every living organism to us, it requires a miracle. Anyone who's saying this is a chance, this is just simply by blind evolution, is simply not looking at the science, the real science. And in fact, I start out this chapter 6 by quoting a bunch of scientists who basically say, part of our view of science is that it must exclude God. If we have to involve God, it's not science. Well, what if truth is hidden behind that assumption? Because that's an assumption. George Washington Carver, who made that statement about nature being a broadcast station, also said, science is simply the truth about anything. So if you start with this a priori assumption, the smartest person in the world is going to end up at an irrational conclusion if they start with a wrong assumption. What I do is detail each stage of the supposed theory of evolution and ask you, can this happen randomly? And I don't think it comes close to meeting that threshold. And again, I'm doing this with secular works. I'm doing it with what I call hostile witnesses, statements from evolutionists and findings from them saying, yeah, there's no way spontaneous generation is a myth that was disproven by science, period. And I go through all the history of that, how Pasteur proved it, how it's been proven time and time again. And yet scientists will say, well, we know that doesn't happen, but in order to have life, there had to be spontaneous generation, period. I'm like, hey, you're defeating your own logic here. You're in a complete circle. So that to me is really just what the Bible says. Look around you and say to yourself, could this possibly be random? Look at why would there be beauty? Why would there be beauty in nature? What evolutionary purpose does that serve? How do you explain all this? Why would there be love? Why would we have morals? I mean, quite frankly, from an evolutionary perspective, the strong survive perspective, there's no reason to differentiate morally between killing someone who's down and out and helping them. Because ultimately, we're all dead anyway. Why the heck does it matter? Why not just steal their food, take their whatever?
Kill them, take their CD collection.
Yeah. There's just, and some people will say, well, if we all cooperate together, things work out great. And that gets you so far. But also, what if you can get away with it? What if I could steal that thing and nobody knows about it and get away with it? There's just
Wow.
no moral framework for, there's a lot of atheists I love and respect, and they are, in my view, incredibly moral people. In fact, they follow the Bible better than some people I've seen who walked around with one. So you can be good without God. What you can't logically do is define good without God, because there is none. If there's no God, as Queen sang, nothing really matters. What does it matter?
Wow. You're right. And then all of a sudden everything becomes, kill or be killed, eye for an eye. But that isn't society, and that isn't who we are as humans. How does that apply to the non-believing societies or the societies that believe in total different faiths? How does that affect, their morality?
So it's funny you say that, because I was thinking of something just as I was talking about this whole thing. So the truth of the matter is, good things happen when we obey the moral laws in the Bible. Bad things happen when we don't. Whether you're an atheist or a firm believer, it really doesn't matter. These laws are universal. To me, it's evidence that the Bible is true, that there's a God who loves us, cares for us, and I would encourage anyone who's an atheist who may be listening to this to ponder that. Say, how would this book, thousands of years old, get these moral laws right? And there's an incredible example of that in an academic journal. I'm struggling to remember the year, the name. I think it was in the journal Nature. I think it was a study in the journal Nature. And it had this really complicated title, but this was the bottom line to it. It found that when they looked at our societies that are alive today versus those that were extinguished over time, almost all of them practiced what was called socially imposed monogamy. All right, now let's dig a little deeper into this here.
Socially imposed monogamy. Okay.
Socially imposed.
Okay, I'm only going to have one spouse because the society says I should only have one.
Yeah,
So
that's the norm.
Okay.
The societies that promoted polygamy or sexual anarchy, they were all wiped out and killed. Do you know why? STDs. Before modern medicine, right? That can completely wipe out a society that's just having sex at random with everyone. I mean, that can spread like wildfire. And in fact, even in today, where we once had a socially imposed monogamy, and that's kind of falling apart, and we still have modern medicine, millions of people are killed by STDs. So when you hear God saying, hey, one man, one woman, and you go, oh, that's kind of restrictive. I like a lot of women. I don't want to do it that way. God says, hey, this is for your benefit. It's not to harm you. It's not to stop you from having fun. It's actually to give you a full and awesome life.
Wow. It's like everything that we need to have a full and awesome life it literally is in the scripture. It's crazy. And I shared this on a prior show, but I won't go too far in the story just for our listeners. But I had literally my wife and I's marriage was in shambles. It was on the rocks. And then we started going to counseling. And the counselor said, hey, read this book read this book. And the book had, was faith-based overtones and everything. And Ephesians, where it talked about, a man is commanded to love the wife like our own flesh, and how he commands women to respect their husbands. And anyway, that one verse, literally, I just applied that to my marriage, and my marriage got exponentially better. And that's one of the things that kind of led me to, to having faith and getting on the same page as my wife, Jim, I'm like, man, if this one sentence here can fix my marriage, then like, what else is in this book? And the more I read and study it and apply it to my life. So for you atheists listening, if you want a better, happier life, listen to Jim and just read that book. Just start studying the scripture. And man, I love what you mentioned earlier, how you can take the scripture and go back and, okay, what was the original Greek meaning? And we could do a whole other show on that, because, like so many of the Greek, the original translated words, when you start to understand those, the Bible has even more impact, But anyway, we'll save that one for another time. But Jim, we're going to wrap up here shortly. I want to give you, I want to hit you with one more question to just leave our viewers on the edge of their seats. But talking about the nature of broadcasting, there was instance that you made me think of with that, where so if you think about like the number 5 or 4, any number, pick any number, right? So would the number 5 exist without a conscious mind? And the answer is really no, because humans had to write the number 5 for that to become a reality, you'd think, right? Except then you can take the numbers. There's like this really simple math equation. It's called the Mandelbrot set. And the Mandelbrot set is just a very simple math equation. And you can plug any number into it, and it'll plot onto a graph. And if you put enough numbers into it, it starts to plot a design called a fractal, which goes on and on for eternity. And the fractal, you can literally zoom in on the plots. If you plot, and there's computers that have now plotted billions of points into this little simple equation called the Mandelbrot set. And then when you start looking at the images that is produced by graphing the dots on this graph, you get spirals, you get ice crystals, you get broccoli, you get leaves on ferns. So the numbers existed before the human mind created them, which means we didn't create the number 5, God did. So there was a conscious mind because those numbers are found in mathematical equations in nature. And that didn't happen on accident. So a conscious mind has to create a number. Thus, to me, that is evidence. I almost used the P word. Thank you for teaching me that tonight. So just a very powerful thing where nature broadcasts, that God, evidence of God. Jim, this has been an absolute amazing interview. If there was one thing that you would say would bring a non-believer closer to God that's happened to you in your life, there was one story you could share or one piece of evidence that you feel like would bring a non-believer closer to God, what would you want to share with us as a parting conversational piece?
It's all of the evidence, but I'm going to tell you something that just opened my mind to looking at the evidence. I always felt Christians as an atheist were a little bit weak, mentally, physically. I felt that they used, the Bible as a crutch, and that was just my.
That's a Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche mentality.
Is it? Okay. Well, that was just my impression for whatever reason, that whole turn the other cheek mentality. And I was, a wrestler, weightlifter, tough guy, really a fake tough guy. But, I respected strength and courage. And I saw something once from a guy that I knew to be a Christian that I felt was so amazingly courageous and powerful. It just opened my mind like, oh, I don't have to be a wimp to be a Christian. There's something special in this person that I admire and I look up to. So I was coming out, me and a bunch of people were coming out of a theater, and it was a business meeting. There were a bunch of people in suits, and it was in an area that was kind of bordering on a rough neighborhood. And there was a literal gang war going on outside of this theater. And these 18-year-old kids were hitting each other with sticks and bats and punching each other. So we, of course, moved across the street. And all of a sudden, this guy walked right into the middle of this thing. His wife was screaming, no, no, no. He walked right into the middle of this thing and dispersed it. I mean, this guy he wasn't going to be able to take all these kids, really young men. But I just thought that was so courageous and also so loving that he would go in to the middle of a gang fight to stop these kids from hurting each other with no regard for his own personal safety. And that's really what Jesus did for us, didn't he? He said, no man has greater love than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. And one of the strongest evidences for the Bible, the truthfulness of the Bible, the reality of Christ, is to see the beautiful, amazing, courageous things that people who truly trust in him do.
Wow. And he goes on to say, I choose to lay it down and I can pick it back up if I want, but that is a choice that man made to put himself in harm's way. Beautiful, beautiful story, Jim. Jim, it has been an absolute honor having you on the show tonight, my friend. I cannot wait to read Rational Conclusions. Now I see where Tom gets his coolness from, by the way. Your brother obviously comes from you. Seriously. But Jim, seriously, it's been an honor having you on the show. Humble Faith listeners, this has been another show with an amazing guest of Humble Faith, where normal people may express their fears, doubts, questions, and concerns about their faith. This is Sean Kelley signing out.
Thank you, Sean.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.